After some years went by with my attempting to work with colleagues and students in terms of how to frame these earlier transferences for study, and framing them in terms of the kinds of scenarios that went back and forth, and then finally beginning to frame them in terms of the earliest transferences of the connect and the disconnect. We had published a number of cases in some of the books that you see here today, and we had a chance to teach and to discuss these cases over really a long period of time. But what was still missing was a particular opportunity to show, I want to say, the nuts and bolts of technique, which, with the connecting and the disconnecting. And so fortunately, I'm grateful to a man that I'm going to call Paul for allowing me to present his work today. And once again, I have to give my faint apology for needing to stay near a written text, which you all understand for discretion is there. But I believe that this case will be a totally different kind of case in the sense that I want to look at the details of ours and the back and forth working on it. And also, you'll see that over time, I've become really quite brave in working this way. So you'll see a lot of courage in this particular case, but I think it's working well. Presenting confidential analytic material to colleagues for research and training purposes necessitates disguise in order to protect the privacy of the client. Since my purpose in presenting this material is to illustrate a certain kind of transference and countertransference development, I've chosen to omit virtually all family history and life information of Paul that does not directly bear on the transference and the countertransference. Early in the therapy process, Paul brought some journal notes that his mother had kept of her observations of him during his first 2 years. So interesting, she'd actually sat and written notes about the baby, and he brings them in. What was most striking in the notes was how detached his mother, Louise, felt from her child, and how cruel that detachment felt to the boy, who wanted very badly to relate to his mother, but who was constantly thwarted by his attempts to reach her. She, apparently not having the slightest idea how to relate to a baby, would at every juncture when he approached her find some way of shutting him down, cutting him off, or frightening him away, thereby chronically prohibiting a connection to her from developing. And it's just like, it's right there in her notes, watching. He's approaching, he's doing this, he's doing that, and she would do something to startle him. And if he would startle and move away, or baby go boom kind of thing, she would be okay because she couldn't stand the demand of the relating. And it was very interesting to have it in a mother's own handwriting. Paul's frequent telephone conversations with his father had the quality of banging loudly and angrily on a door that would not or could not be opened, though there was an occasional sense of a stirring within and a goodwill or token attempt by his father to offer a more satisfying response. In Paul's earliest childhood, Leonard, his father, admits that he knew that Louise was emotionally limited and unable to adequately attend to her needs of their children, but he told her how to behave, but she didn't do it. Paul bitterly complains that his father never let him know that he was a worthwhile or important child, that his father never indicated that Paul contributed to his father's life or happiness in any way, and that his father never demonstrated that he saw Paul as a valuable or competent person. Now, his father would say that's not true, but those were his feelings when he confronted his father. Paul continued to assert that he will not be okay until his father confirms him, shows interest in him, proves to him that he is indeed worthwhile, that he did not intend to make Paul feel that he is a miserable wretch of a person, nor does he need Paul to persist in conforming to this belief. So needless to say, I spent quite a bit of time trying to confront that it's not until you believe that you're okay, that you will be okay. Convincing your father will not do it. Much of our time together during the early phases of therapy was spent going over various relationships at his work, with Paul obsessing on how badly he manages things, how imperative it is that he find ways of relating more positively to work colleagues. He's certain that he alienates them, that he forces people somehow to think that he is weak, inadequate, incomplete, or a slob, incompetent. Paul feels he's different from other people, somehow weird or not quite human. He frequently despairs that he will never be okay, that he will never be a whole, competent, and satisfied person. On these occasions of despair, he makes it clear that it's my job to reassure him, to prove to him in some way or another that he is a worthwhile person and that there is a way out for him. So my job is to prove to him that he's okay and that he can change and that he's a fine person. So you can see the father transference got immediately put there. Implicit in Paul's conviction about the nature of our interactions is the setup for the emergence of the organizing transference. The belief is firmly in place that no matter how much I try to relate to value, or to humanize him, Paul will never be able to accept that he is good, worthwhile, warm, caring, generous, worthy, or loving. So no matter how I may reach out to him, no matter what connections I may try to form with him, no matter how affirming I may wish to be with him, the writing is on the wall in terms of the organizing transference. The connection will somehow be broken by his succeeding in making me feel disgusted by him, tire of his continuous provocations, and come to see him as desperate and boring, and ultimately I will have to hate him. During the early treatment phases, I attempted in many ways to imagine how it was that Paul managed to prevent interpersonal contact or to break connections once formed. I listened closely when he talked about his relationship with his family members, his business colleagues, his long-term friends, and his living partner, trying to determine how he manages not to sustain or actively to break connections. I have on occasion been able to show Paul from countertransference material various ways in which, if he wanted to be more warm and engaging with me, as he says he does, he could be relating to me more intimately and creatively, but he's not. Which, by the way, that took me quite a while to be able to get to that place. But I began to realize this is a major issue for this man, that he cannot show appreciation. And so at various times when I knew that we had connected well or that he had appreciated something, I would almost batter him until he thanked me or showed in some way or another that he likes what he was getting from me, and so on. You know, it's sort of like not exactly the kind of thing that an analytic practitioner imagines himself doing, but it took some narcissistic balls, if you will, to be able to do that, to say, I really think that you appreciated me a lot today and you're not saying so, and not let him leave until he did. All right. Your analyst didn't behave that way with you? During the early, oh, let's see, I did that, but he's not. Okay. Paul thus appears, when I would do that, Paul appears momentarily taken aback, but he recovers quickly and acknowledges what I've just said about how I am doing in our interaction. He seems to grasp that it may be true that he shows signs of recognition of how or why I might be feeling a certain way. In these moments, he also seems appreciative for the contact that he feels through my forthrightness, my honesty, and my insistence. But then he moves quickly on again, not knowing quite how to sustain the conversation in a relational mode unless I persist in pulling him back, confronting him, then he veers away from interpersonal contact again. So here's sort of a sample a year into therapy. Paul speaking. As people encounter me, I subtly behave in ways so as to discourage or at least not to encourage the connection. I feel this scary, paranoid distortion, and I'm unable to bridge it by showing kindness, warmth, or generosity, or by being at ease with the other person. In this distortion, I feel that they don't like me, or that they want to use me, to abuse me, or to cheat me. I then subtly withdraw. This clearly comes from Louise. Later, like with Sue at work, the other person and I are glued together in an unstated but conscious contempt and mutual hatred. Maybe she doesn't really feel the contempt or the hatred for me, but I feel it coming from her, and so I give contempt and hatred, and then I finally make her hate me. Larry, I hear you're saying that when a person, perhaps even a neutral person, who neither loves nor hates you, moves into your life and is giving neutral or perhaps even lukewarm, getting acquainted responses, your paranoid delusions take over, and you feel that they hate you or want you dead, like Louise. You then radiate coldness or distance, which alienates the other into a standoff, with each waiting for the other to show warmth and generosity to bridge the gap in the relationship. Paul, and then I'm stuck. I can't go across any bridges. My distortion makes me afraid, and so we play a standoff game. I'm scared of them, and they of me. Unless that person clearly and affirmatively reaches out, we are not sure if we can trust each other. I can't initiate warmth and generosity. No way. The best people can see of me is that I'm withdrawn and scared, even if they can see that I have honest intent. But you know, I can appreciate their warmth and generosity. What I do have to stand on in relationships is that as a person, I'm honest, reliable, and intelligent, and I can appreciate their warm overtones even if I'm scared, standoffish, or appear more openly cold and hostile. It's not just that you're shy and afraid, I say. No, I'm forbidden to reach out. This image is, to me, is very meaningful. He says, it's as though there's a force field from outer space that paralyzes my brain, injecting terrified anxiety feelings into me. An outside force setting up an overriding terror which totally prevents me from sharing intimately, warmly, generously, affectionately, or presenting myself in a positive light. I have to be passive, awaiting their judgments and their pronouncements on me, which are bound to be bad. Even if their estimations of me aren't negative at first, I make them bad. I actively make people see me in a bad light. That's the important part. I force people to see me as bad. Larry, I feel like you're trying to do this to me right now. Now, the actual struggle which Paul has me snared in during this hour is with me trying to keep him focused on our dynamics that relate to us rather than to talk about his parents or work colleagues or elsewhere. And what's not necessarily coming through in the notes is that there's sort of a struggle between us, with me trying to stay in the here and now and us, and him continuing to try to veer off. Paul says, I'm trying to throw you off, not just something passive, to make you feel bad feelings towards me. You are actively thwarting our connection right now by the way you interrupt and prevent me from engaging in conversation by changing the subject or diverting the focus before I've had an opportunity to digest your ideas and to respond thoughtfully. I've told you I put myself down, that I don't show pride, I degrade myself, I act negative, witty, depressed, I act paranoid, like they're taking advantage of me, I act hurt. I put on my martyr thing. See, note again how he's pulling away, all right? I forcefully pull him back. I think it's even more subtle than that. I have the image of two people with neutral or lukewarm feelings toward one another, wanting to get to know each other, and slowly approaching each other as though they're getting ready to do a relationship dance. This is what I'm trying to focus on. There are these invisible tendrils of relatedness, silently reaching out. He, interrupting, says, and I have scissors and snip them off. Exactly. If someone seems to me to be acting coldly toward me, I take it personally. I believe they don't like me. I believe they hate me. And they, in subtle ways, act differently, hurt, defensive. Then I get all hurt and angry. And then when they may only be in a bad mood, or perhaps tired, or perhaps impatient, or they're feeling something that has nothing whatsoever to do with me, I take it personally. I'm not going to give in to them. I give them the cold shoulder. For example, at work, maybe they're looking bored, withdrawn, or sleepy. I feel they hate me. When I'm feeling paranoid and defensive, then it affects my behavior. It starts an icy cold Mexican standoff, and then they cannot approach me, and they begin to think bad things about me, that I'm weird, or that I'm strange, or that I dislike them, when in fact I'm severely afraid and suspicious for no reason at all. How do these snippers come out? I ask, again, trying to pull them back to the present. Well, if anyone seems displeased, annoyed, or whatever, then they get an exaggerated personal reaction from me, like they've hurt me, and that's how I shut them down. But if the other person puts out positive tendrils, I still get paranoid anxieties. I get scared, timid, and that drives me crazy, like, you must think I'm a horrible person, and if you don't, I will do things that convince you that I'm not worthwhile. I think you're trying to do this to me right now. You're cutting me off. Now I'm focusing on the immediate struggle. I felt that I had a complex formulation about two people approaching each other and what might happen in the interaction. But at every attempt to reach out and give my picture to Paul interrupts me with his elaborating but diverting comments. Okay? I'm aware at the moment that no matter how important what Paul is saying is, he is disrupting my thoughts. That's the key point. Thwarting my reaching, threatening my inner cohesion from where I'm reaching toward him. Now, in a way, this sounds kind of radical because, you know, we've been trained for years that we're there to be there and follow the patient's thoughts and to try to go with the material and the flow. But after a period of time, I began to realize that if I just did that, he would still remain all over the map. And then I began to realize that whenever there was going to be the possibility of contact, he would actively find some way to thwart me. And then I began to become aware that he would thwart me by causing me to lose it inside. That is, he would make comments that would be distracting so that my thoughts could not stay coherent and therefore keep a coherent relationship with him. Is everyone following that? So it became a very subtle thing. So that's why here I'm getting very brave and I'm saying, come back here, come back here, come back here. I have something I want to say. Your analyst didn't do that to you? Right? Okay. So it's a different style of working, but you see what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to work on maintaining the contact so that we can then watch how he continues to move away from the contact. Because I now have considerable experience in being led astray by Paul, diverted from potentially connecting course with him, I have the courage now to follow the countertransference to stress. More often than not, when Paul has done this to me, I've used my self-psychological training, descended from myself and my intent, and tried to grasp his subjective position at the moment. But I've slowly realized that merely decentering, following Paul's lead, and achieving empathy with his immediate content simply doesn't cut the mustard. Something profoundly different is at stake. Empathy on a broader basis is what's required. It's not simply the disjunction of two subjective worlds that needs to be understood and articulated. Rather, Paul is actively and with non-conscious intent disrupting my inner world of motivation so that any possibility of emotional connection is destroyed in favor of an intellectualizing and useless discussion. I've been trying for some time to pinpoint exactly how Paul does this with me, and I feel successful somewhat during this session in having found a possible opportunity to show him how this operates, so that even as we're talking in this kind of intellectual manner, I keep pulling him back. I'm aware that Paul's brilliance and his articulateness frequently is used in this way, to distract me, to derail me, and to cause an inner collapse of myself. That is, his seemingly good-natured efforts to relate to me and to expand upon what I've said are in fact functioning to collapse and fragment me in my intent to connect with him. This has happened frequently, and I feel I now have an opportunity and the courage to protest. Paul, I interrupt. I don't let people finish their sentences. Larry, you actually cut off what might become a flow between you and me of ideas and feelings. Paul, I'm so anxious I just spurt things out, particularly if I feel they don't like me. But at this point, by my inquiring and interrupting, I'm forcing him to talk to me. At this point in the session, I note, it feels significantly better. He seems more alive. He is now smiling and looking directly into my eyes, which he seldom does. So by being very aggressive and holding him here, keeping my own thoughts coherent, I've called him here. He's now aware of it and aware that it feels good to be present. But you already know from the organizing transfer, beware. Huh? I got him here. We're connecting. He feels a connection. I feel good about it. He feels good about it. I know you feel you do this. You snip off tendrils of potential connection when you're feeling negative towards someone. But I also think the pattern is more pronounced in positive situations. Paul, I get so pleased someone is responding positively that I spit out a lot of things. I start babbling like a baby. Overjoyed that someone likes me, I liven up and start a rapid stream of babble, which of course he's doing at the moment. Larry, and in so doing so, you cut off the positive tendrils because of the Leonard and Louise living inside of you. You snip off the connections. He looks puzzled. I'm not interested, I say, in the behavior or the content of your conversation per se, because you always maintain a stimulating conversation and you have interesting things to tell me. I'm more interested in the sole activity of exactly how you manage to snip off the connections that potentially could connect us. Paul, I start babbling like a baby. And then they say, for example, Sue says, shut up, leave me alone, you're interrupting my thoughts, go away. And so the Louise that you identified with in infancy, who's still living inside of you, has snipped those connections, has forced the relatedness flow to stop. You comply with the inner Louise instructions to break off the threatening connections by needless babbling. And so in happily babbling, you destroy the potential tendrils of real connection. You now do with Sue or with me what you once experienced being done to you by Louise. By being overly excited and overly solicitous, you destroy any possible bridges that might be useful in building a relationship. With Sue, you confuse her. With me, you derail me into talking psychobabble with you. And you do so cleverly, intelligently, good-naturedly, and in such a way that it goes almost unnoticed. You hook me in every time. But still, Sue or I feel somehow cut off, confused, or lost track of. So that's was 1 year into therapy. I'm going to skip to about a year to show you how the interaction is developing. These are my notes, and I'm just reading my notes. I was disturbed after our session yesterday. I need to write now, so I'm writing this down. I'm feeling that the dynamics we are experiencing are something that I need to try to capture, and so I wrote the following paragraphs. Here's what I'm just writing, trying to sort out what happened to me. At this point, Paul and I continue to intellectualize pointlessly about various matters of concern to Paul, or I can attempt an empathic drop into my feelings, those stirred up by Paul and by our relationship. It's much easier to go along with the topics he brings up, but they go nowhere. I often feel on the verge of being in tears with Paul. Exactly what the tears are about seems just beyond my conscious grasp. There's a sadness that we cannot quite interpenetrate more deeply and freely, and both of us enjoy and benefit from this process of being with each other and exchanging with each other. Paul frequently complains that I'm not giving him enough, or that we need some kind of a breakthrough. When I press him to elaborate what exactly he needs from me, he becomes frustrated and wants to withdraw, to give up. He explains that he needs a more aggressive, affirmative approach from me to draw him out, that somehow I have to know how to get him out of his mess. Last night, I began our session by recalling how unhappy he was with me on Monday. Paul asked me to define that, to take him back to Monday, as he usually does. He likes me to initiate discussions to get us going. I felt that I had a purpose in trying to revive Monday and a place where I wanted to go in terms of what I wanted to tell him about Monday's session. I wanted to free associate myself a bit about the countertransference in specific directions that might bring him out in some new ways. I started, quote, ever since we began, I've had a series of half-formed images, many of which from time to time I've tried to speak, and I get cut off. Paul was off and running, and I never got to finish. He talked the whole hour, and at the end commented with slight criticism that I had not said one single thing this session, and I agreed with him. Back to my notes. I was on the verge of tears during the entire session while he's talking. I was wanting somehow to tell Paul how important a person he is to me, how I do deeply value him, how I do like him, how I respect him, how somehow I do find him important to me and I need him. But I was not able to speak up in the session, or I was not being allowed to say how I felt. But the tension created in me during the session caused me to experience more about my predicament than I'd been able to feel before. Content-wise, I wanted to share the half-baked images that have been gradually forming from the beginning of our relationship, of simply wanting somehow to be Paul's relating partner, to share days with him, to be totally involved in and meshed with him, the sense of being one, of totally being with him, totally containing him, totally enveloping him, guiding him without leading him, of being an external structuring influence which would foster his growth without directing his unfolding process. The image that I've had is to be present with him, interested in him, attentive, and encompassing in some way a sort of a total supportive net. Throughout this whole 2-year period, I've kind of had these thoughts coming from time to time. I've had fantasies of standing next to Paul at the proverbial party punch bowl where he hangs out feeling lost and lonely, and silently egging him on under a concerned and watchful eye, evaluating with him his every move, his every reaching out, his every feeling, his every pain, his every withdrawal, to be a silent, supportive partner. All of the things Paul believes he is, I know that he is. He's good-hearted, he's sympathetic, he's eager to contribute, he's desirous of beneficial interactions, he's a charitable person, he's kind, he's loving, he's worthy, and all of these things that he wishes that he were, I know him to be. My role would be, through my very presence of strength, of being, to expect, nay, to insist that Paul live out in spades all that we both know that he really is. My watchful eye on my presence would not permit him to back down or to withdraw or to wimp out in any way. And if he was struggling or floundering, my presence would be his stay, his compass, his life support, as he found new and creative ways to move forward on his own. The tone of all of these images that have come to my mind is one of wishing to surround him, to support him, to envelop what is already there in a way that it strengthens itself, so that what Paul can become so that he can be, what Paul is can become realized and enriched through vibrant interactions with people. That's the content of my images. Affect-wise, these various images, from being in his home with him, to going to work with him, to being in social settings with him, to sharing family life with him, are accompanied by almost choked-off tears. At times, the tears seem to be of sympathy or empathy with him at how miserable his life and his interactions always have been for him. The feelings are of pain, like he has on several occasions expressed in a cracked voice or in tears in our session. At other times, my choked-back tears seem tears of joy, like I'm on the verge of finally finding my lost baby, or perhaps even my lost mother. But the holding back, the choking back quality still prevails today, almost like it did in last night's session. Those are the notes that I was writing. Now, this is as far as my writing got, but I knew that I hadn't quite said all I wanted to say. That is, I feel like in my writing I'm trying to say there's something going on here. What is it? I'm aware of these images. I'm aware of these feelings. I'm aware of the choked-off tears. I'm aware of just wanting to somehow just be there with him and let him use me in some way to become whom I know that he is and can become. This is as far as my writing got, but I knew that I hadn't quite said it all. In the beginning of next session, Paul opened with a fantasy that he had completely alienated me yesterday when he wouldn't let me talk, and that I was going to tell him that he was hopeless, that I couldn't work with him, and that our relationship was over. He said sooner or later this happens in all relationships. The fact that I had ended the hour yesterday rather quickly without reassurances, and that he had talked so much, and that I'd not had a chance to talk, led him to believe that I was going to finally throw him out today. I explained to him that we were on similar wavelengths about last night, that something important was going on, but that I had not arrived at a wish to throw him out. Instead, something else entirely different had happened. I chose to read to him the above paragraphs that I just read to you, and a lively discussion ensued. I was hoping that the unfinished countertransference thoughts would emerge and crystallize in discussion. That is, I felt like I was just so close to knowing something and I couldn't quite say what it was. Paul seemed enlivened by my interest, but not quite sure if he could trust it. He attempted to minimize it by various means, which I systematically confronted. I told him I wasn't going to let him get away with doing to me what he does to everybody else, that is, not letting the connection stay. He was not going to push my interest and my feelings away like he almost had done yesterday, that I'm going to remain emotionally present no matter how hard he tries to push me away. At the end of the hour, we had a discussion in which I pressed until Paul acknowledged that indeed my interest and concern did feel good to him. He was reluctant at first to admit it, but when he finally did, he flashed a bright smile. Once again, my insistence that we stay together served an interpretive purpose, as if to say, you believe that you cannot be interested in, or that we cannot be interested in or to enjoy each other, but it is not true. Someone asked me earlier in one of the breaks, when I talk about interpretations as nonverbal things, what sort of interpretation? You see, by just being there, by insisting, by making clear that I was there, that he was not going to alienate me emotionally, that's my interpretation. What if I am interpreting? I'm interpreting, you believe we can't be together, and it isn't so. So that was the nonverbal interpretation. And he did like it. The countertransference content seemed to register my lost, lonely, and shut out, helpless to find Paul, my mother. I clearly did not want to participate in the tendril snipping kind of relationship style that Paul had first learned with his mother. Now, when I teach about the nature of the organizing level transference and how to begin teasing it out, working it, and ultimately interpreting it, I always begin by emphasizing the very long prodromal period of establishing safety within the relationship that's required. So in my consultation groups, people come in and they say, I've been seeing this person for 2 years and I'm not sure we've gone anywhere, but as we listen to it for a while, we begin to realize that the kind of people that live the organizing experience in spades have never been able to connect to anybody, and it's not safe. And so no matter what good guys we may think we are as therapists, no matter how warm and loving we think we might be, and no matter how good we think connections are, people coming to us cannot believe that. They can only believe that connection is dangerous. And so it takes a long time for the person just to get used to coming to the session, being there, not being criticized, not being put down, not having interpretations forced on them. There's just a simple safety, and it sometimes takes many, many months and sometimes several years. I've seen instances in which 2, 3, or more years have been required simply for the establishment of a sense of safety, given the extent and the nature of the damage suffered in early life by many of these people. This early period of safety establishment often resembles a search in the spirit of Kafka's characters. The developmental metaphor would be an infant searching for a nipple to connect with, for a maternal presence to begin a safe, satisfying, and nurturing rhythm with. The prodromal safety searching in this type of therapy can seem endless to a therapist. Many times therapists express surprise that the client keeps coming without any apparent purpose or progress, and yet never misses a session, always pays on time, is there, is interested, and the therapist sort of feels like, what am I doing here? And it seems like, this has happened to you, I can tell. It seems like we have to realize that these people cannot move further in their therapy until it is basically a safe place to be. They will not be invaded or violated, and that takes a long time. I hesitate to call it trust. Trust is more advanced. This is just safe. I will not be hurt when I come to your office. Many times the prodromal period seems tiresome, boring, or tedious to the therapist because the content centers around non-human concerns, paranoid delusions, somatic preoccupations, disorientations in time and space, or other contents that I often term, for the sake of clarification, little green men. Okay? That is, when we look at all the different kinds of cases that come and all the different kinds of content, I finally decided we might as well talk about the little green men from Mars. That is, it's going to do about as much good. But it has to be talked about. Okay? My reason for wishing to stigmatize the incessant searching filled with psychotic or organizing content as little green men is to be able to point out the relative usefulness of the therapeutic discussion of the content. That is, you've all had experiences of following the content on and on and on. And if there's one thing that 100 years of trying to deal with psychosis has taught us, is it is useless to follow psychotic content, no matter what its nature is. It doesn't take us anywhere. The content may seem of crucial value to the client because it may be all he or she knows to talk about, and it also expresses in some way the nature and extent of the internal distress. But the therapist who has done much work with these endless stories full of organizing or psychotic content knows full well that no therapeutic progress ever comes directly from a discussion of the little green men content. The therapist's dilemma is that he or she is compelled to maintain rapport by talking about the little green men, while at the same time being aware that so long as we're talking about little green men, we'll never be able to get to the work of the crucial problem of why the person's in therapy. And the problem is simple: the essential inability to form and to sustain human contacts which permit personal growth, enrichment, creativity, and enjoyment. For the last 2 decades, we've been in our field working with the so-called borderline client, or what Margaret Mahler would call the symbiotic client. And in all of our learning, we've learned that relationship is good, that connection is good, that borderline clients fear abandonment, okay? And that so what we try to do is connect, hold, and contain. As we're now beginning to appreciate that many of these clients have deeper parts that are not exactly bonded, that they're more unbonded, more pre-bonded, more organizing or more psychotic, or we have other people that come in that have never been bonded, we begin to realize an entirely different kind of technique is needed, because these people do not feel safe being contained, being held, or being responded to, and relationships are not good. Relationships were the vehicle that they experienced as being traumatizing in infancy, that it is through relationship, through reaching out in a trust relationship, that they were once frightened, hurt, or damaged. So that for them, it's the terror of relating is what has to be worked with. In the present case, the little green men revolve around intrigues at work, telephone calls with father, worries about mother and siblings, concerns about career curve, doubts about household details, weekend expeditions, vacations, conferences, business meetings, and so forth. But the central problem around which all the little green men revolve is that Paul simply does not know how to initiate or to sustain ongoing interpersonal emotional connection with another human being. The logic of this is actually fairly simple. Through millions of years of evolution or through the will of God, whichever you prefer, babies are born ready to bond. We see babies come into the world. There's already a certain kind of physical bonding in the womb. They're ready to begin finding mother. They search. They open their eyes, their ears. Babies are ready to bond. So when we have a child, a baby, who does not bond at all, or who only bonds partially or in certain areas but not other areas, we have to assume that there's some kind of a reason that the bonding has failed. Now, sometimes we can attribute the reason to a birth defect, a genetic structure, or something that in the hardwiring of the baby. The baby brings something that makes the bonding experience impossible. But the longer we study psychotic states, the more we realize that if we want to go the direction of constitution or genetics, takes us down a way that doesn't fit for most people. That for most people, the failure to bond or the flaw is not genetic, not constitutional, not biological, but rather it is dynamic. That is, early on, either before birth or in the few months after birth, there was some traumatic experience that happened that caused the person to constrict and to hold in, to not reach out, and to not bond. So by the time we have such people in therapy 20, 30, 40 years later, what we have to do is to first of all make the place safe, and then secondly we have to begin encouraging the bonding. So that the psychoanalytic frame, as it was originally created in order to deal with high-level people with neurotics, so that we could deal with verbal, symbolic material, okay, does not serve for these people. It simply doesn't work. Talking doesn't work. The problem is long before words. Even relationship, like we might try to do, and holding and not abandoning people, like we do with our borderlines, doesn't work. Rather, we've got to be there trying to make the place safe. Then, in order to frame the problem, which is disconnection, we have to promote connection. That is, we can't study disconnection until we've got connection. So as we go now with Paul, you're going to see that I'm actually working very hard to, with like Reese's Pieces and E.T., pulling him in, trying to get him to connect and to be with me. And to some it may sound like it's supportive therapy or ego therapy, or like I'm trying to train him how to have a good relationship. That's not the purpose of it. The purpose of it is to pull him in so that we can feel connected and then wait for the terror. Wait for the body signs. Wait for all that he's frightened of that will hurt him in connections to begin to take over, because that's where the transference is. So, repeat. Transference at this earliest level is the transference of disconnecting. And the reason is because the person wouldn't be stuck at this level, or parts of their personality wouldn't be stuck at this level, if they had been able to connect in the first place, if the bonding had occurred. Since the bonding hasn't occurred, there are parts of their personality that are terrified of connecting. The only way we can study the terror of connecting is to encourage people toward connecting, so we can then have the terror in the room. Now, with the Sandy case, you recall, the way we had it was when she actually was there, and I extended my hand to her and said, would it help you stay here if you held my hand? So that she could actually then, as she stayed present in the room, begin to feel the terror of two live bodies being in the room, feeling one another's presence. So with Paul, we're going to be working on that again. So repeat the psychoanalytic frame for a psychotic organizing level transference, whether it's in one of us or in somebody who lives it in a more pervasive way. The frame is trying to find that area where the person cannot connect, bring it into connection, and wait for the terror to appear so that the basic belief can be interpreted. And here the belief is, you believe we cannot stay together and be interested in one another. We can't enjoy each other. We can't love one another. It's simply not true. And ultimately, it's going to be a nonverbal interpretive process that's going to win that day. In the present case, I told you the little green men revolve around all of this. He lives in a Kafkaesque world in which people, scenes, pressures, and forces move in a vaguely incomprehensible, incoherent, or chaotic way that Paul tries to bring order to with his movements and his thoughts. The Kafkaesque search for connection with other people is reminiscent of the fundamental search of all mammals for a breast. Mammals, I'm convinced, are born with the genetic instruction, find the warm body or die. And so what we begin to realize is that in earliest infancy or before birth, When there was some kind of an obstruction in that path to the warm body, the warm breast, the warm maternal mind, when there was an obstruction there, then I believe that the infant actually then kicks into that genetic fear, the fear of death. And many of these people will tell you it's death that I'm afraid of, or it's being empty. It's not being a real person that I'm afraid of. And Winnicott, in his last paper, said that it's these people who will tell us it's a fear of breakdown, I'm going to go crazy, a fear of emptiness, and a fear of death. And all of these are properly interpreted as what you're afraid is going to happen has already happened. That there was a time in infancy when you broke down, when you felt emotionally dead or the threat of death, when you felt empty because there was nothing around you. And those are experiences which you're afraid are going to happen if you continue on the relating trail to me, because it was within a context of relationship that emptiness, breakdown, and the fear of death first emerged. One might even go so far as to say that the very means through which the human mind is passed down through the generations are initiated through mutually satisfying connections. It's through the baby's sensual potentials that the mother appeals to the baby and draws the baby to her slowly, carefully, empathically, so that the various rhythms that two connecting human bodies must share can begin. Two bodies and their capacity for sensuous experience allow for a bridge which comes to link two minds and then gives rise to mental and relational enjoyment. It is the caregiver, the parent, the human mind as it has evolved through the millennia who knows that each baby must be carefully brought into connection with the mind of the group in order to develop its full relational capacities. Each mother who shares the group mind, the culture, and its emotional language extends through human empathy in her own way, through her own personality, this group mind, this accomplishment of the human race to her baby. And it is through her empathic extension of her mind, first experienced by her baby through sensuous physical ministrations, and later through psychological attentiveness and attunement, that allows the baby a bridge, to bridge the gap from what we might distinguish as ordinary life of a mammal to the special, cherished, and sacred life that's possible for human beings. It's only recently been possible for us to extend our psychoanalytic theorizing down to the earliest months of psychic life. The organizing transference is so named because the infant's first task is to organize channels to the environment. In certain people, these earliest transference memories have played critical formative roles in their development. Babies come into the world prepared to create interpersonal bonds in a variety of ways, and all individual caretakers with their own specific personalities and life circumstances inevitably fail in one way or another to stimulate the baby's full potential. So to a certain extent, organizing experiences and organizing transferences are universal. Memories of infantile trauma record in the body and the mind the ways in which the child did not dare reach out to the environment for fear of being re-traumatized. In my technique with Paul, I'm aiming to bring him into the here and now focus of our relationship and the specific pattern of aversion which were presumably developed in infancy in relationship to his mother and father and what other caretakers, and that have remained active in his personality to make it difficult for Paul to live in the world of human beings in a satisfying and productive way. My aim with Paul is to continue focusing on our relatedness and the ways in which he experiences me as doing something to frighten or hurt him, and the ways in which he somehow manages to put a limit, curb, or governor on his own extensions towards me so that we don't effectively and consistently connect. Over the long haul, the goal of this kind of treatment is to promote connections so that we can study the ways in which Paul manages either to foreclose the possibility of a connection or to arrange a disconnection. Baby and mother arc metaphor. This is a very interesting session that happened a little while later. I'd been thinking about Paul one weekend and had a formulation that I thought was particularly apt. On Monday, early in the session, I began to try to pass my formulation on to him. But not unlike a session that's been previously reported, I experienced my attempt to express myself as consistently thwarted by Paul. Silently, I began focusing on the countertransference in terms of the frustration I was experiencing, the discouragement I was feeling, and my easy willingness to let him just go on and to give up expressing myself. At the same time, I was aware of my very strong desire to say what I had to say, and so to connect and somehow to get him to see me, to understand me, and to take in what I had to say. In my countertransference reverie, I was trying to follow the full range of emotions that accompanied these thoughts, as I would from time to time during the hour, once again attempt to speak, only to be overridden by Paul's response. I, at length, fell mostly into silence, and at the end of the session, Paul commented that he was aware I hadn't said much, and that he felt disappointed by my lack of response. I was awakened in the following morning by a very upsetting dream. I was enraged. My body was shaking, my fists were clenched, my jaw was tight, and I was sweating. That was the dream. That's all there was. Only a very few times in my life have I ever been so absolutely enraged as I was upon waking. I was just shaking and sweating. There was nothing left of the dream imagery or of exactly what I was enraged at. But I knew that the dream related somehow to Paul and to emotions that got stirred up in the session the night before. I was troubled most of the day about it, trying to recall the dream content. Without my usual waiting to see what Paul had on his mind that day, I said I had been awakened by a dream. Paul asked immediately if I was angry with him. When I inquired why he asked that, Paul reported that he had not allowed me to talk the day before and that he thought that I would be angry with him. I told him that my dream itself was lost, but that the point of it seemed to be the stimulation in me of murderous rage occasioned by experiences of repeated frustration during our last session. But that I now somehow felt that my rage was on his behalf, that the missing piece in the things that he was telling me about his childhood was his rage. It seemed to me that I was dreaming it for him. I felt the rage in my countertransference frustration somehow belonged to him. Paul resonated very quickly with it, first with his father, how enraged he is that his father won't listen, giving me several examples. Then he gave examples with his mother. In the aftermath discussion of my dream and the countertransference reverie from the day before, which I told him about, a metaphor developed between us. I began by imaging a young baby attempting to do something, striving to achieve something, perhaps learning to stand, feeling its feet on the ground, its hands in mother's hands, and then eagerly bouncing up and down, fully delighted to feel the muscles involved in the standing and bouncing. Then the baby feeling a great sense of triumph, of laughter, of joy and power, as a total connection is experienced between the ground, his overall skeleture and musculature, mother's hands, mother's eyes, mother's smile and mind, and the fullness of mother's body in her groundedness, a full arc. The baby joyously feels enlivened by a powerful energy arc linking two grounded minds and bodies. But then, for some reason, mother suddenly becomes disturbed, preoccupied, or frightened. And then the connection is broken between the baby's body, the baby's ground, and her mind, her body, and her grounding. Paul angrily interrupted. "She scared me." He then reminded me of some of the cruel and startling things that Louise had done to him that were recorded in her notes that she had kept on him as a baby. So the metaphor evolved that just at the moment when the baby Paul was reaching, extending, joyously feeling the power of his being, connecting with his mother, Louise would, for her own reasons, become frightened by the connection and in some way or another startle, scream at, make grimaces, or do something to cause Paul to collapse suddenly and cower in terror. The expectable murderous rage towards his persecutor had become instantaneously foreclosed by a startle response, fear, and collapse. The entire cycle of searching, reaching, feeling fleetingly connected to, and then collapsing or darting away was internalized so that both the startle and the rage are foreclosed from experience. The baby simply knows that grounded relating is treacherous. Did you follow that? Yes. That is that the dream and the rage that I was coming up with was a piece that was missing. And where was it missing? Now, it's not that he doesn't or didn't rage at his parents in various ways. He did, but it was useless rage. It wasn't the rage that, where were you? Okay? And so we began to realize that in the startle response, the baby can't be angry. It's
it just misses it completely. When we're startled, rage may come in later, but right then we collapse with fear, and so the baby would collapse with fear, and the rage never got a chance to be processed. This metaphor has proven useful to Paul and me. The active ingredients include the baby feeling its body, its power, its strength, and its attunement with its mind, and the baby reaching towards mother and bouncing joyously, feeling powerfully attuned to the ground and to mother's mind. At that moment, what must be destroyed in the transference memory is the connection to the mind of the mother other. The internalization of this rupture demands not only destruction of the connection to the mother, but because of the startling and sadistic quality of it, the child's connection to himself, to his own grounding, to his own body, to his own rage. What is retained in body memory is crushing constriction that spells, never go there again. Never feel joy or triumph in your strength, in your relatedness capacity, or in your creative potential, because if you do, I, mother, will startle, frighten, and abandon you in the moment of achievement, and you will collapse devastated, no longer grasping for me, no longer needing me, or demanding a relationship that scares me because I cannot understand or tolerate it. Paul added, I learned to approach her in a self-effacing, self-negating manner so that she would not be threatened by my needs or by my presence. I still do that with everyone. I make sure that I'm experienced by others as friendly but non-demanding, non-threatening blob. I felt as if we were connected, Paul and I, as we were going through this, and bouncing joyously together, and by the end of the session, both of us determined not to let fear, rage, and collapse intervene. So I would like to then move to a section here in which I experienced the countertransference as being overwhelmed and exhausted. After a brief holiday break with several missed sessions, Paul returned with a series of fresh episodes to fit into his content modules. I tried several times to make comments or to intervene, but I was unsuccessful. He needed to keep talking and give me new material. In the countertransference, I felt myself withdrawing and quite exhausted, quite unable to muster up the energy to force myself into Paul's awareness or into an interaction with him. So you can see the way that the content modules were serving was just making a connection impossible, and we had just had a 2-week break. I reported my countertransference sensations to Paul first off the following session, when once again he began with his hands folded saying, well, what now? He loves for me to start the sessions, all right? I told Paul that I'd become aware of feeling overwhelmed by him, of feeling unable to integrate all of the various things that he has to tell me, and of often feeling unable to follow him when he goes from content module to content module, and of the feeling of being unable to integrate his diverse associations in a meaningful way. Okay. Once again, you can see the theme that I'm trying to do of his invading, disrupting my mind, making it impossible for me to think or to remain coherent or to give a response, and that so long as he's effective in doing that, then we can't connect. The way I've often said it is, if we were to imagine that between you and me, if we're having a relationship, there's an energy arc that starts with my feet, runs up through my body, comes somehow across space into your body and down to your grounding. There's a full back and forth. And if we're going to have a relationship to throw a ball back and forth, all of me is involved in making that energy go that way and in receiving yours. So if they're going to break that energy arc or break that connection, it could be broken anywhere along the arc. Well, the ones that we often think about logically are the ones where something between us breaks down. You might turn away, breaking visual contact, or you might change the subject, making mental contact. But a more subtle way of ensuring the break is to do something in my body, in my mind, to cause me to lose my coherency, or to cause me to become distracted, and the break is accomplished again. And so it becomes very interesting to notice how people manage to make the break, to start for the contact and then to make the break work. And often it's in the mind and the body of the therapist that the contact is broken. And then, you know, it's hard to track because at first you begin to think, why am I distracted? Why am I doing this right? Maybe I'm incompetent. Why is my mind wandering? I'm not able to think very clearly, or well, you know, maybe I didn't get a good night's sleep. We have to think of all these reasons why I'm not doing it right. And yet, at some point, when we begin to realize here, this man is motivated to make certain that I cannot remain present for him, that he, by in one way or another, distracting or preoccupying me. When I say rather daring things like this to Paul, by trying to show things like that, he quickly perks up on him, seeing where I'm coming from, and then expresses pleasure and gratitude in various verbal and nonverbal ways that I somehow seem to be onto him. So, then you're just ready to give up on me like a hopeless case, he says. Humorously, I told him that he's not so lucky as that, and he then insisted that it was my job to take more initiative, to be more aggressive and assertive in affirming him, that this is what he needs in order to feel more cohesive and more coherent. I told Paul at various times when I have given him very positive affirmations, have shown him to be a valuable person that he is, and have demonstrated how I do regard him, that he's not able to make use of that. Let's see. The break in the energy arc between us then had been occurring in many different ways, as I try to show him, at the level of my internal integration. And Paul knows how to produce that in me. Through wide-eyed intensity and overload, a kind of withdrawal, disorientation, and fragmentation, such that the communication link cannot be achieved. He no longer needs a live Louise to cut him off or to cut off the tendrils or to withdraw. Paul now carries Louise implicit in the way that he approaches others, and that functions to replicate the fragmentation and withdrawal that once belonged with his mother. So then I want to move to the next area of interest, which I call pushing the talk button. See what this happened. An interesting little variation of the content module activity slowly emerged the week that followed. On one evening, I was more tired than usual when Paul arrived. I caught myself wanting to push the talk button, to move Paul into a content module so that I didn't have to struggle trying to relate to him. Well, I can't say this is the first time I'd had this thought by any means, but it was the first time I caught myself having it, and I thought, what? And so I told to him that I just had this thought. I told him that I was wanting now to just push the talk button, get him to go into a content module, and get him just to go on so that I didn't have to relate to him. Paul looked shocked and he turned pale. But that's not right, just getting me to talk so that you don't have to do anything. And I said, I know, but that's what I want to do. So what would you like to talk about? I'm not going to do it. I'm paying you, and you have to do your work. Not if I could trick you into leaving me alone. How long have you been doing this to me? I don't know. I just noticed it tonight. I'm going to really have to keep my eye on you. You're much worse than they are. And we both laughed. Okay. What follows now is a summary of a 3-week working through period in which some interesting images and metaphors were developed. We had discussed at length how Paul avoids real connecting experiences by either devaluing or over-idealizing himself unnecessarily. Now, keep tuned into here because you're going to hear the bipolar trend here in this, so that when he devalues himself, we go to the depressive end, and when he over-idealizes himself or who he should be, he goes towards the manic end. So as we begin to pay attention to, with all of the negativity, he manages not to connect, but with all sorts of feelings like, but I've really got to be positive, I've got to be wonderful, I've got to go into the world with enthusiasm and creativity, and I've got to be this wonderful person, then he manages not to connect either. So really what I'm starting to work on during this period is, so long as you're either devaluing yourself or feeling that others are devaluing you, or you're overvaluing yourself or feeling that others are overvaluing you, you're not staying in reality. You're not staying in the here and now. You have had a life in which it's been difficult for you to relate. Your skills at relating are limited at this point in your life. You've got to learn to go forward step at a time, inch at a time. And needless to say, that makes him unhappy, because then at that point he says, you've got to give me something to catapult me into positive things. So with the negative delusions on the one hand and the positive illusions on the other, I had the format I needed for beginning to focus on the importance of living in the real world. It took Paul a while to grasp where I was going with this notion of living in the real world, and he didn't really like it at first. I found myself talking about driving the middle of the road. Keep track of this, because later we're going to have something very interesting coming up about driving in the middle of the road. That I'm busy saying to him, don't fall off the road with depression, don't fall off the road with mania, go straight down the middle track, because that's how you're going to be able to connect. Okay? Keeping one's eyes on the road, putting one step in front of the other, and being aware at all times of the work of relating. I asserted that he regularly escapes from the nitty-gritty of everyday living by dropping into despairing delusion, or conversely by fleeing into idealistic hopes and illusions for himself. What I had been able to formulate is that every time there's a relationship pressure of any type, Paul's tendency is to escape the realistic relational demand, whether it be doing supervision at work, talking with a colleague, making a phone call, planning a trip, or simply reading and writing. Paul does his best to avoid other people making relationship demands on him. He often accomplishes this by dropping into despair or racing off into idealizing fantasies. Now we're developing some real relationship examples to work on. So here's an example we'd been spending a number of months, but we reached a crisis with it. One particular supervisee, Arthur, has been a concern to Paul for many months. This particular man has shown an inclination to be lazy, not to take his work seriously, to slough off, and to say he's done things when he hasn't done them, and to actually out and out lie at times about a number of things. But Paul has been very reluctant to supervise him in an adequately limiting manner, and has lost a great deal of time and work from the man as a result. Although Arthur has a sarcastic, lackadaisical attitude, there is something about his inability to maintain concentration and determine in his work that Paul identifies with. So that Paul has kept hoping that just with empathic treatment, the man will somehow come around. Over a number of months, I've continued fairly actively to challenge Paul on why he was letting this man take advantage of him. We've reviewed how much it was costing his company to keep Arthur on. I've made many suggestions in terms of directions he might go to seek consultation from colleagues or outside management experts on how to set definite guidelines for the man, how to begin supervising and managing Arthur in a more effective way so that he could be gotten rid of, or so that he could come to realize that he had to shape up and produce and to realize his potential. But all my efforts in questioning and making suggestion aims at bringing some clarity, some sanity, and some responsibility to the supervisory situation had been fought in a variety of ways and regularly backed off from Paul. So during the last session of the first week that I'm reporting, however, I got a very interesting report from Paul's changing relationship with Arthur. It seems that Paul's ability to relate more determinedly and creatively with Arthur had followed the more determined relating that he had experienced me doing with him. On the morning of this day, Paul had finally pinned Arthur down around a particular work project that had been delayed, put off, and sloppily performed for a long time. Paul sat down with the man, and for 1 solid hour, the two of them, side by side, worked painstakingly together in getting this particular project working. Time and again, the man would want to veer off the project, and Paul would pull him back. Halfway through the hour, the man was perspiring rather profusely, but Paul stayed right with the work anyway and kept him going step at a time, step at a time. By the end of the hour, he himself was sweating quite a bit. As Paul described the blow-by-blow details of this hour of two people working creatively together, I picked up on each detail from the standpoint of two people staying realistically engaged with each other around a very definite, realistic, and worthwhile project. I empathized with the strain that had been on both of them to stick with it. I highlighted the realistic step at a time, doing just what one could manage so that the other could follow, and so forth. Paul did have a real sense of victory about the entire day and was pleased to be able to report all of this to me. He hadn't opted out of the fray this time like he usually does. I made some attempt to relate it to the general discussion that we've been having this week about a relatedness demand and how he would typically do anything to avoid a relatedness demand. But in his interaction with Arthur, he was facing the problem head on. What are we going to expect? Okay. Are you ready? A disaster. Okay? Good connection. He connected with Arthur. He connected with me. We were doing things realistically together. We were moving forward. He felt really good about it. The following Monday, Paul came in looking a disaster. He had an absolutely terrible weekend, the worst of my entire life, he said. You just don't understand how absolutely terrible these feelings are. We have to devise some new system so that you can understand what it's all about. All of that talk last week can't even begin to touch how bad things can be for me. The whole weekend and all of its misery were somehow connected to you, to what we did last week. So he knew that. He couldn't pinpoint exactly how the bad weekend was related to last week, but he knew it was, and that in some way I was to blame for it. Paul described having had numerous what he calls paroxysms of rage throughout the entire weekend. The paroxysms of rage would periodically be linked to Leonard, his father, at Louise, and at Arthur. But his voice tone in telling me all this, he was raging at me. You know, you could just feel that he's telling me that all these paroxysms of rage, and he was thinking about this and that, but he's angrier and angrier and angrier at me. He was deeply disturbed. His breathing would seize up, and he was seriously concerned about how bad things were. It was really quite panicked. There was in his voice a strong but desperate pleading tone. Several times I thought Paul was going to break into tears as he told me about the miseries of his weekend. In the number of years that I saw him, we had very few tears, but occasionally there would be a breaking in his voice, and you could see his eyes watering. And I thought we were going to have one of those. He was that close to a kind of a fragmentation. At other times, his entire body began to move towards a boiling rage as his face got red, and he got into a full guttural tone, almost like an animal ready to attack me. The attack was at the world, at life, at his situation, and almost at me, but he couldn't quite focus any of it. It was a very powerful, deep body, lifelong rage that the Arthur episode had set off in him. Paul was unhappy with me that I don't understand how they want him to be, how his parents forced him to conform to their miserable expectations of him. I cautiously but definitively expressed my delight that he was allowing himself to have these experiences. This is so hard. You know, when you work and you work and you work for these connecting experiences, and then you have the fragmentation that marks the terror of the connection, to be able to say, great, you know, you're doing just the right thing, we're just where we need to be. But it's so important to be able to do that because actually the client knows it. That is, the client knows that they are now falling apart, regressing, and they know that they have had to work very hard to get to that place. So I'm busy telling him how wonderful, how glad I am that he's finally there. But I'm having to go a little bit slow with it. That this rage was long overdue and that his discomfort is very important to our work. He protested that he absolutely can't do it. He can't do it. These feelings have to stop. I can't stand these feelings. They're absolutely terrible. If this is our work, I don't want it. I assured him that the feelings must not stop, that this is the most real he's ever been, and that he's waited a lifetime for this rage and despair to begin to emerge. I endorsed his temptation to lay his anger at my doorstep because it was indeed our work last week that had set this off, that released these powerful sensations that tormented his body in such terrifying and painful ways. I said I was sorry I had not predicted this outbreak because knowing it was likely to come might have made it easier on him and more accessible to self-observation. By the way, that's something that happens by the time you're working with someone for a period of time and you've been through enough of this where you're watching the connection, you know the connection is going to set off a regression, and then at some point after a connection you begin to say, okay, now, be ready. We don't know what's going to happen this weekend, but we've had a very good week, so be ready and see what happens. Well, sometimes it's really good because that particular piece of information lets the weekend go on fine. But when it doesn't, at least the person is able to say, you know, I was glad you said that because it was really bad. So after this first round of visceral expression with my reinforcing it, saying that it had to go on, and his insisting that these feelings had to stop, Paul told me that oddly enough, on both days he got 5 or 6 hours of very good, creative, solid creative work done. Usually when he gets upset at anybody, he can't work because he obsesses and goes into a despair. So he was aware that there was something in this weekend that didn't fit, which is that he'd have these paroxysms of rage, but then he would just do really strong creative work. I interpreted the creative productivity to be the result of knowing where the problem was coming from, knowing that it wasn't him, knowing that he did not have to be incompetent for them, and that he could go ahead and to do that which he enjoyed doing, good, hard, creative work. I told Paul that I was sorry that this was so painful, I was sorry that he was so miserable, and that this hurt so much. But he's been holding on to this rage since infancy, and he does have to bring it out now. No, I want to be positive, good, warm, loving, and caring. I don't want to be rageful and despairing.
I pointed out that in his descriptions of his paroxysms of rage over the weekend, he never fully directed his rage at me. He said no, and then he himself wondered why not. He said because he knew that I was somehow to blame, and then he told me, I had a dream on Saturday night towards the morning. And here's the dream. So right in the middle of this horrible weekend, after this week of connection, but right after he's also now raged at me, here's the dream. I was in a new place. All of my old friends and colleagues from my previous company were there too, and there was a new and expanded space. My old colleagues and even my competitors were all there, and he lists them, so he's sort of that he experiences as enemies. They were all there, and somehow or another, they were all working under me, cooperatively and harmoniously. All was going well with the work properly going forward, and it was good. There was love and there was warmth together. There was cooperation together. But no sooner than he told me the dream, he says, we have to have a breakthrough. That we can't have feelings like this going on, that he's going to go crazy, that he can't stand these feelings, that it's not possible for him to feel them, and they have to stop. I insisted that the flow of feeling was essential, that it was possible, that he did do it, that he could do it, that he was going to continue doing it, and that even while he was in the midst of the worst, he got more creative work done together, and I interpreted the dreams in terms of the new expanded space and the pulling together of a number of different relationships under his own control with a sense of positive, creative, warmth, cooperation, harmony, and love. I further interpreted the conservative unconscious part of his nature, that the conservative unconscious part of his nature is reacting violently to this newfound sense of connecting to himself and to others. My insistence on sustaining connection with Paul is my interpretation of the disconnecting transference. Everyone seeing that? I'm giving you a lot of the words, but the words are not where the action is. The words are in the way that I'm staying with him, holding him there, insisting, following through, inviting the rage, inviting the fear, and the nonverbal interpretation is, and I do put it into words, but I'm not convinced that words help. The nonverbal interpretation that's important is, you can do this. You can stay connected. You can be competent. You don't have to be incompetent for them. You can change. Actually forcing a shift, insisting on a change in his relatedness mode, brings the sky crashing down, causes a painful somatopsychic regression or fragmentation in which confusing, disorienting, terrifying sensations arise which mark a shift from the tried and true non-relatedness patterns. None of the details or content formulations per se are critical, I'm convinced, but rather the process of formulating, suggesting, pressing, and coaching serves to frame the moment-by-moment, nose-to-nose relating, which Paul is terrified of, but is being slowly brought towards tolerating. And the next section that I like is the point at which I think the delusion finally gets unmasked, the delusion finally gets stated in a very clear way. Because, you know, you work on these things for years at a time, and finally, after you've worked and worked and worked, you finally get an image or you finally get something that summarizes really what it's all been about. It's as though I'm writing, the planets are lining up in such a way that let's see, I'm going to skip to that. Okay. Paul struggles with an employee to whom he has given heart and soul to helping for the last 8 months. He supervises her in a situation that is threatening to end in disaster. Paul has done everything in his human power to make it possible for this deeply disturbed and distraught woman to work productively and pleasurably for him, but he's clearly up against overwhelming odds. Edith appears to be irretrievably helpless, fragmented, and desperate. She goes from one pathetic illness or weakness excuse to another, hardly showing up at work, arriving hours late, leaving early, claiming her first full salary when she wasn't there, and not reporting or making up missed time. Paul is totally unable to be firm, to draw boundaries, to hold limits, or to clearly state his expectations of her because he alternately feels sorry for her and identifies with her, and then fears that his needing something from her, his pressuring her to perform, his provoking her with sarcastic criticism is incapacitating her. In short, he has a perfect emotional replication of Louise, his mother, and is completely crippled in the face of this weak, helpless, sick demeanor that Edith presents him with.
Last Wednesday, it fell into place with my confronting and supporting him the entire session on how he must finally and firmly manage Edith. He saw it and had been slowly moving in that direction for several weeks. I was firm and almost harsh in not letting him blame himself for her failures, for her irrational rages, and for her basic incompetence. After our session, so once again, he's with me. We spent a long time working on it. I confront him. He stays with me. He's ready now to feel connected with me and work with Edith. After our session, Paul was restless and couldn't sleep all night, returning to disturbing sexualized fantasies and his long-standing nightmarish belief that he is somehow weird, strange, inhuman, and perverse, that something is truly and deeply wrong with him. He was impatient and angry with me the next day, clearly understanding that our interactions the day before had catapulted him into a chasm of despair that has been his lifelong nemesis. Paul did have a good talk with Edith, however, today, in which he spelled out firmly and in detail how he saw her problems. We had a lively, intense, and heated discussion most of the hour, in which I firmly insisted that he was on the right track, that he must hold Edith to the line, that he must be firm with the expectations and deadlines he has set for her today. Paul was distressed and in agony and openly angry with me for pushing him, for insisting on clarity, and for refusing his repeated statements that he is incompetent, deformed, defective, and psychotic. At times he's actually screaming and shouting directly and ragefully at me, really letting me have it for a number of things. I stayed with the rage, that I wasn't helping him, that I too taxed him, that I shouldn't expect so much of him, and that I wanted him dead just like his parents. It was intense, direct, passionate, contactful, as I parried his every thrust, inviting more until his anger was finally spent, knowing that the duel had been a contactful challenge for both of us, the best and the most meaningful connection we've had ever. So, disaster? On Monday, Paul appeared blanched, tight, and more pent-up than I've ever seen him. He looked tight, nervous, and terrible. Thursday, after our last session, he had tossed and turned all night, sleeping badly. In the shower Friday morning, he suddenly found himself obsessed with the statement, "You're right, I am monstrous." Just, "You're right, I am monstrous. You're right, I'm monstrous." Like that's just running through his head. The statement was addressed to everybody in his life, to his parents, to Edith, to his colleagues, and to me, and to the whole world of people who, the minute they see him, think the worst. In the ensuing discussion, Paul hit his thighs hard several times, banged his chest with his fist hard, and finally slapped his face. All strong, somewhat alarming, self-abusive behaviors I've never witnessed from him before. I was a little startled because I've never seen him. You know, he's banging, and finally he hits himself really hard. And, you know, you begin to get some sense of what the history of this has to be, you know, as it's being lived out in his body. But I was really alarmed because it was strong. The abusive internal parents were alive and well, and now they were defined and known. Paul was angry with me at how true it was that he is a monster, and there's nothing to be done about it, no hope of change. He hates himself, he might as well give up. At one point he sneaks in, "And you think so too." And that's been a theme song of his all the way through. Whenever he goes through another barrage of self-criticism, it's, "And you think so too." But I was ready, and I promptly refused to endorse the delusion. I reiterated that he is not defective, that he's only delusional about his monstrousness, and lacking in a set of relating skills which we could work on developing together. I reiterated my belief that he's committed to messing up every possible relational situation by insisting that he's a monster, but that I absolutely refuse to endorse his cruel and self-destructive delusions about himself. And so, following that, two more final metaphors developed that all I'm going to mention today. The next one is called the free way of life. They're in the third year of therapy. Following a number of interactions which had an increasing sense of personal connection between Paul and myself, and between himself and many others, I began again pressing him towards more engagements with other people in various places in his life, that there are other relationships that could be developing that would give him a lot that he's not developing. While Paul knows that learning how to establish better interactions is essential for his well-being, he's remained mired down in the delusion that others have negative views of him, don't want to relate to him, and wish he would go away or die. After a series of somewhat more successful efforts on the socializing front, Paul developed a freeway phobia one weekend when visiting his parents. He had never experienced driving difficulties before. He was in the center lanes of a large freeway with traffic moving rapidly in all directions. Remember I said months before where he talked about, okay, here it is. Okay. Paul was struggling to make sense of all these lanes and signs when he suddenly became acutely panicked and had to take the first opportunity to get off the freeway, calm down, and take surface streets. Over the weeks, as he's elaborated the freeway phobia, which kept coming up, Paul talked about how, you know, you can't afford to think about what you're doing on the freeway if you want to negotiate complex driving situations. You have to intuitively just move and make decisions based on knee-jerk kinds of instantaneous judgments. If you ever once look over your shoulder and think how fast each vehicle is coming, where they're going, how you're going to negotiate between each one of them or how fast they are, then you're going to become immediately confused. I interpreted Paul's freeway phobia as a representation of the freeway of life and of complex relationships. We considered jointly how much driving a freeway is like negotiating relationships. If you stop to think about things or explore frightened or paranoid feelings that may come up in the course of a conversation, you become immediately lost and panicked and have to pull out of the relating scene. Over several months, we noted many examples in which Paul had to withdraw from relationships in order to avoid confusion and fear. So that once we had this idea down that the freeway phobia is a living representation of how to stay safe in the middle of a complex social scene, we then found many examples of it. But no sooner than we were able to contextualize each phobic episode that he had on the freeway, in the day or the week of some social interaction or in our relationship, Paul would quickly retreat to, but what if I really am in the middle of a freeway and really do become truly paralyzed with fear, and then I become unable to pull off and I crash into other cars? You know, that could really happen. I could become so paralyzed I could just crash, and then I'd kill myself and somebody else. It might get so bad I can't even go anywhere. I might not even be able to come here to see you. I regularly interpreted Paul's fear of becoming frozen with life-threatening fear as the very mechanism he uses to justify not moving forward, not going ahead, flying by the seat of his pants, trying to do the best he can intuitively, both on the freeway and in relationships and in life. I accepted no excuses. I said he could pull off the freeway anytime he needed to, or while he was learning to be brave, he could try an anti-anxiety medication to give himself the courage to try out new interpersonal experiences. I suggested Xanax. I said, if you need it, use it, but keep going. The phobic anxiety was clearly serving to signal Paul of the dangers of spontaneous relating that he was increasingly engaging in, and to remind him that interpersonal connections feel terrifyingly dangerous and as though they might kill him or kill the other people that he's relating with at any time. And so my final and favorite image that I think you're going to enjoy, the banquet of flesh, which I believe pulls together what you've heard about Paul so far. The final relational image to be discussed began after a series of more intense personal engagements had occurred with me around Paul's increasingly effective social interactions. The background to the episode to be described has already been touched on lightly. Paul has had a way of getting into a cycle of devaluing himself in various ways, citing many personal interactions and his recurring belief that others see him as ineffective, weak, confused, miserable, a miserable wreck. The images, the people involved, and the negative qualities vary considerably, but the downward spiral of Paul's self-criticism invariably drones on in a similar vein, ending with the surprise line directed at me, and you think so too. Okay? And this has gone on throughout our time together. I've gone through various phases of how to respond to this challenge when thrown at me. In the early phases, I would protest that I had no such view, that in fact I liked him very much. I saw him as competent and respected him in every way and so forth, depending on whatever barrage of self-criticism he had just offered that day. But Paul always had me in one way or another, because he would quickly quote something potentially critical that I had indeed said earlier in the hour or on some previous occasion to prove that I really thought the worst of him. He would give the line a deadly negative twist to prove that I did think ill of him, that he was right, that it was true that I saw him a sloppy, miserable wretch or a ne'er-do-well or whatever. At first, I would go into momentary confusion at his misinterpretations of what I'd said. I would try to correct him, try to say, I didn't say that. Then I learned to confront him and to dispute what he was imputing to me and then reaffirm who he was. So I've tried all sorts of ways of dealing with this. But these downward spirals of self-criticism, followed by a gauntlet thrown to me, continued. At times, I tried to go with whatever negativity might have been implicit in my former comments. But then I would attempt to show Paul that my meaning was essentially positive. After a while, I got frustrated and tried to point out the double bind he put me in on these occasions. At other times, I would get angry with Paul, insisting that he was deliberately distorting. And then I would try to show what his motivation might be for needing to see me as a harsh critic of him at this particular point in time. So I just gone and gone and gone trying to win in this. I tried various ways of exploring meanings, of looking for contextual cues, and of attempting to align Paul on the side of studying this interaction, all to little avail. Something about this was not yet understood. Eventually, I could feel myself squarely in Paul's trap every time he laid it. I simply lapsed into looking at him inquisitively in response, trying to get him to elaborate on what had just transpired between us and why. Paul wasn't uncooperative in these searches for meanings, but he always somehow got back to the refrain that I indeed hated him and that I had said it clearly in so many words, so no matter how much I tried to deny it. Of course, we tried various transpositions of Louise and Leonard transference material, but we never quite got anywhere. After a particularly social but frustrating weekend, Paul had the following dream. I was going somewhere with Jerry, whose passivity all weekend had messed up a series of plans. Like we were in some European city, maybe Paris, and we were supposed to be going to eat at this rather elegant cafe or bistro or restaurant. When we arrived there, we were shown the sideboard where 2 live horses were laid out, sedated with their eyes covered so they couldn't see what was happening. We were handed these knives or meat cleavers and a plate in sort of a nonchalant way, like this is what you were supposed to do. For your dining pleasure, here's a cleaver and a plate in this elegant bistro, was to chop off chunks of meat, live flesh, to eat. Like it was supposed to be some sort of a delicacy, and we were expected to simply go along with it. I recognized it as bizarre, as something I simply didn't want to do. I was immediately nervous in the dream, and I began looking around like maybe there was some vegetarian dish. I was very upset, and I began thinking almost immediately about my relationship with my father, Leonard. In Paul's associations to the dream, he emphasized the element of passivity, being passively led to this banquet of flesh, that he was simply expected to go along with this horse's ass kind of banquet. He and Leonard are always taking chunks of flesh out of each other's carcass, and it's supposed to be okay, the proper and pleasurable way for 2 people to relate. In the dream, the 2 horses are laid out, sedated and blindfolded, so they won't actually see or feel what is being done to them, that is, this passive position. Paul could see that the underpinning was, of course, the scenarios with Louise, in which each had to be the destruction of the other, but both pretended that everything was as it should be. Paul said that he has always felt forced to passively comply with this bizarre and monstrous feasting of flesh that was in vogue in his family. My interpretation focused in a congratulatory way on Paul's actively deciding in the dream to turn away from this lifelong pattern of feasting on flesh, this scenario of mutual cannibalism, that he turned away to something different, namely to something that he sees as nourishing and healthy, vegetables. So we processed this dream in a whole variety of ways, but I kept pointing out that what wakened you was your need to shift to vegetables. It's the shift out of the flesh-eating banquet that provided the anxiety that wakened him. A week later, Paul started into another one of his downward spirals of self-criticism. By now, well accustomed to the horror of watching Paul rip himself limb from limb in these tirades, I watched with a fresh image of flesh-eating banquet in the back of my mind. I'm watching him, and I know where it's going. I know soon the gauntlet's going to be thrown to me, and I'm just watching it. This is the first time I've ever actually been able to watch it approach, and the idea of 2 taking chunks out of each other's flesh, I'm thinking, here it comes, here it comes, here it comes. This time I saw the gauntlet coming a good 3 minutes before it landed squarely in front of me. I was lying in wait, almost in open-mouthed amazement, watching Paul's downward spiral of self-effacement with horror, knowing he would soon launch his surprise attack on me. I wish I could remember the exact content, but I was swimming in intensity of the moment. Paul suddenly looked up directly at me and said his usual, "And you think so too." But I was ready. I went with it. I continued his vicious, destructive banter along the same content lines that he had just provided me with. I told him that it was true that I hated him, that he was indeed worthless, psychotic, delusional, despicable, a miserable wretch, and so forth. I just laid it on. Paul was stunned. But grasping my ploy, he quickly added, and here comes the new material, "You take your pleasure and amusement from watching me tear myself down and slowly self-destruct. You take your pleasure and amusement from watching me tear myself down and slowly self-destruct." I immediately fell into a pit. In this quick, brief exchange in which I had gone after him and he added one more line, we had deepened our emotional material to a horrifyingly new low. And then Paul added, "And you do so you can feel secure in your superiority." I was truly stunned. I remember thinking, I was swimming, I was aware we were on new ground, and I remember thinking, I have to go there. I've got to feel this. I've got to go. There's something critical about this. And I did. And the two of us sat in momentary silence. I let my body and my mind drop into the experience of taking my pleasure and amusement from watching Paul self-efface and self-destruct in front of my very eyes. And I enjoyed it. I actually allowed a full sense of cannibalistic glee and destructiveness to overcome me. Paul was trying to talk, but I waved him off to shut him up. I mean, I knew I was going to a place I had to go, and I just said, and he's kind of opening wide-eyed. My mind swam in timeless delight and horror. Images of Caesars languishing in decadent delight in the Roman circus swirled before my mind. I saw slaves being slaughtered and eaten by lions. I thought of Nero. I thought of Rome burning, of Hitler, of lines of Jews, of the ovens, of sod, of naked savages chewing on human bones. Tears welled up in my eyes. My stomach churned in a violent upheaval. I stammered, trying to speak, telling Paul what I was experiencing, that this was going through my mind. My voice was quaking, facing a wide-eyed Paul, and I slowly came to myself. I can't do it. I can't do it. I won't do it. I refuse this godforsaken banquet of flesh. Show me the vegetables. And we both laughed. We were both taken aback, shaken by the truth and the violence of the moment, and by our mutual willingness to go there. Vegetables were a comic relief. As a child, Paul, you had no choice. You were led to this flesh-eating banquet and expected to partake. It was all that was offered. You had no way of knowing that there was a better way. You were drugged and blindfolded and told to eat. But I'm not a child, nor am I passive. This flesh-eating banquet you lead me to and keep me in is a bizarre horror, and I will have nothing to do with it. I will not eat of this banquet. I had to repeat the line several times just to get myself out of the place that I had fallen in, to rescue myself from this emotional pit that I had let myself feel. The swirling horrors, the timeless spinning, and the disgusting nausea of destruction. I saw it. I felt it. It was terrifyingly real and horrible. I won't go there with you. I absolutely will not. Dreams represent the conservative part of our primitive minds, and they're the last to give way to character change. When Paul was wakened from the dream by his refusal to be passively led into cannibalizing chunks of flesh, I understood his anxiety as his fear of turning away from the table that has always been laid for him. When Paul once again tried to take me to that flesh-eating banquet table, I finally grasped at an experiential body level what has perhaps been Paul's deepest truth. Paul and I were together at last. We were both refusing to be passively traumatized. Paul has for a lifetime feared relationships based upon the template of a drugged, blinded, cannibalistic scenario. But until now, Paul has been compelled to return repeatedly to the self-destructing sacrifice for his internal parents' amusement, pleasure, and self-aggrandizement. It was the only way of relating that Paul has known. Early in life, Paul learned to turn the experience around, to reverse the roles, and to sacrifice his experience of others by destroying the very links and the emotional possibilities that might set him free and allow him to grow. Paul's deep pattern was yielding at last. Thank you.